welcome to another episode of I Made That. I'm your host, Chloe M. I Made That podcast. All right, guys, today we have something a little bit different. First of all, we have our first repeat guest, so I'm super excited about that. We brought back Chris Kaufman, who probably most notably from his StockX days, but as we'll dive into, he has dabbled in all kinds of fun stuff. So in particular, I have been really fixating as I've been doing a lot of recruiting lately about how it feels like people are constantly making the wrong hires based on personal opinions. Chris had a ton of valuable insight last time he was on here on how to schedule and work with like creative workflow. And since he was on last, he actually graduated from Northwestern with an MS in learning and organizational change, which sounds really fancy. So I felt like he was the perfect person to have a conversation with regarding building teams and finding the right people to do so. So please welcome back my guest, Chris Kaufman.
Thanks, Chloe. It's great to be back.
Yeah. So let's start with, can you run me through a little bit more about what was involved with your degree from Northwestern? Because to be very honest with you, before you told me that you were going through this program, I have never heard of this. So learning and organizational change, what all is involved in that?
So the best way that I can describe it is it's like the people side of business that MBAs don't get super deep on. And something over the course of my career that I've been super interested in is organizational effectiveness, culture, organizational psychology, how all of these things play into building a team and essentially creating effective change within organizations. And that's exactly what the program touches on. It's a mix of organizational psychology, change management, knowledge sharing. It touches on a lot of models and frameworks, and it really brings all of these things together in a way that you can effectively implement them in organizations.
Fabulous. I do feel like it is something that does get kind of overlooked when it comes to the business side of things. So I think it's wonderful that there is a program in this space where you can really dive deep on the people side of things and the effectiveness of that. I think that if you ask most business owners what their biggest problem is, it's usually people. So it would make sense to really deep dive into this.
Absolutely. And especially in early stage businesses, it's so easy to let it be an afterthought. And having done multiple startups, it's something I'm super interested in, really, helping others figure out how do you make this a priority day one, and how do you really establish that mission and that vision and philosophy around hiring and culture that is going to build a foundation that sets the company up for success in the long term.
So I think culture is one of those things right now, especially that's a big buzzword. Everybody wants to speak about how good their company culture is. How do you start working with, let's say you have a startup, how do you work with them to start forming what they want their company culture to be in a way that is meaningful and is not just kind of fluff words?
So, I think the biggest thing is culture has to be authentic, and every business, every organization has a culture, whether it's good or bad or somewhere in the middle. There's no avoiding having a culture. And I think the most important thing in the beginning is really laying out what your value system is. And one of the most difficult things that I find is companies will have a set of values, they'll have a mission, but they don't always have people on the team that are supporting that mission and vision and upholding those values. And that can come into hiring and building teams, that can come through how you're leading. But at its core, the founders or the leaders of the organization have to buy into whatever that value system is that you're laying out. And if you're not, it becomes clear very early on that it's just words on paper and it's not something that you're actually upholding. So, step one is make a value system that you can actually adhere to and you actually believe in, and you're going to live and breathe every single day. Because if you're not, your employees are immediately going to call BS on it and they're not going to buy into that.
For sure. I think that from my standpoint and what I've seen in a lot of the different clients that I've worked with lately, the authenticity part is so key and it's very easy to feel. It's almost, in my experience, like you can't necessarily always set your culture. It's just kind of something like you're saying that you're living. So if your leadership, especially, I see this as an important part of it, if your leadership is really setting the tone for what you want the culture and the vibe to be in the office and how you guys are doing business, I feel like that is such an important place to start. That seems like it would be easy, but is not always adhered to.
Well, and so much of it's reactionary too. Like, if you're going to give people autonomy, if you're going to let people experiment, if you're going to let people take risks, how do you react as a leader when those things don't work out? Right? If you create a situation where people feel like they're being punished or they're fearful of losing their jobs when they make a mistake, they're probably not going to be willing to take many risks. If you encourage making mistakes and learning and growing, and you create a culture where everybody knows there's trust, there's psychological safety, you're not going to get in trouble if you do something with good intentions, that's much different. And as a leader, the way you show up every day, that it's a big part of crafting a culture.
I 100% agree. I was just having a conversation with one of my clients the other day about how I feel like a lot of business is very synonymous with parenting, like being a good parent. You want to, create that foundation and that structure. So, like you're saying, your employees feel like they can go out and they can try stuff, but if they fuck up, you know, they're still going to have that base there. You're still going to back them up and you're going to learn and grow from that.
Absolutely.
Um, so yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I guess kind of to piggyback off of that conversation, what do you feel like most leaders get wrong when they think about building a team?
So this is certainly something that I've done wrong at points in my career. I think many leaders focus way too narrowly on skills or credentials. So there's this assumption that high performing individuals are automatically going to form a high performing team. And sometimes that's true. Oftentimes that's not the case. You know, I, I have hired people in the past where they were amazing on paper, and even the work they were producing was incredible. The finished product was nothing short of incredible, um, but the process was in many cases a disaster. And what you look at in some of these cases is what is the trail that's left behind, and how are other people left feeling on the team. And when you have somebody that is a really high performer, but they're constantly creating conflict or putting other people down or making them feel uncomfortable, that is not a great way to build a high performing team. And there are lots of studies that show that the single most important factor in effectively building a team is psychological safety. And that is the shared belief that it's safe to take interpersonal risks. And ultimately, things like team learning, collaboration matter way more than individual talent. And leaders who overlook trust, communication and alignment, I think they miss the real drivers of sustained performance and success within teams and organizations.
Yeah. Do you think so when you talk about kind of these good attributes of a leader, do you think that it's possible for people that are in leadership roles that are maybe not practicing those values currently to change, or do you think it's just something inherently within you? If you're not a trustworthy person, if you're not somebody who's willing to, give your employees a little bit longer of a leash to try things out, can that ever really be changed, or are we just kind of stuck with who that person is as a person?
Well, we're often not stuck with the way someone is as a person, but I think it's really important to figure out what's driving the behavior. And often people will act out of fear. So if they've been in positions in the past as a leader where they felt like their job was in jeopardy because of how their team was performing, and somebody put them in a position where they felt psychologically unsafe, someone more senior than them, well, then you can establish a pattern where this person may be more of a micromanager. They may not give their teams the autonomy that they need. They may not be encouraging collaboration at the level they should. Those are things that people can learn to change. Those are things that people can learn to be better at. Those are things that can be taught. That's behavior that can be modeled. If they have a leader that's demonstrating that it's okay to let your team take risks and fail and learn and grow over time, they can be reconditioned to not engage in some of those patterns, behaviors, habits. What I will say is you can't teach integrity. If somebody lacks integrity or has no value system at all, or has a poor value system, there's certainly situations in those cases where they're just never going to be the right fit. You can teach people skills. You can't teach people to be a good person.
Yeah, well said. So I want to circle back a little bit to what we were speaking about when you were thinking about the idea that we shouldn't just hire based on resumes or what's on the paper.
Mhm.
How do you spot someone with high potential but low experience?
So I, I'm looking for people who are passionate, hungry. Um, they have a growth mindset. Um, there's a concept. It's called learning agility, and it's basically the ability to learn from experience and apply those lessons to new situations. And I think especially in young team members and experienced team members, it's one of the biggest indicators of potential success. And other things I'm looking for is high potential individuals are typically going to tend to show curiosity. They're going to have pattern recognition in the way they solve problems, and they're going to have a level of self-awareness where they're able to recognize when there are growth opportunities for themselves, for the team, um, for a project. These are, I often say, like, the best employees I've ever had are the people who are willing to say they don't know something. They are, and I will say the people that I have trusted the most over the course of my career are the ones who have come to me and said, hey, I want to figure this out, but I don't know how to do it and I need help. That's so powerful. It builds so much trust. Um, people that are asking the thoughtful questions, people that are responding constructively to feedback. All of these things are indicators that somebody has high potential, and they're also indicators that this is probably a person that you should develop, you should support. They probably have abilities that will outperform others who may see talent as a fixed variable. And some of the things that I like to do to support people like this are, you combine stretch assignments with coaching, regular feedback, um, really giving them opportunities to be challenged and grow, and find a place where they're comfortable asking the questions, they're comfortable failing, they're comfortable learning. The best way we learn is by making mistakes, and it's something that's observable to see when these team members do make mistakes. Are they learning from them? Are they growing from them? Are they sharing that knowledge and those lessons with others? And those things are all really key indicators that somebody is going to be high potential and high growth.
Yeah, those were all really good bullet points on kind of what to look for, because I did want to kind of go through on how you support somebody like that. But I think a lot of those last bullet points and those last couple sentences, once you do have somebody like that in place on your team, those are great ways to kind of test them out. And like you're saying, see how they problem solve, see how they're communicating within the team, see when they are receiving feedback, what that looks like. I think that that's something that in my mind really sets people apart. I think very similarly to you, I've worked with a lot of people who are insanely talented, but it's kind of their way or the highway, and that's not good in a team environment. So when we are in those feedback sessions, it's not super conducive to growth, especially as a team.
Yeah, and that's the exact opposite of a growth mindset.
Right, for sure. Okay, so how, if I'm a business, let's just assume that we're a startup, right? How do you attract candidates that exhibit those behaviors? So again, going back to these kind of like high potential, low experience candidates.
Well, a part of it is, if you have a reputation as a company that you're doing those types of things and you're building a culture that recognizes and promotes those types of behaviors, you're naturally going to attract those kinds of people. You know, High performing people gravitate towards high performing organizations. So, it goes back to what we were originally talking about, really building that culture in a way that it's authentic, it is growth focused. There's a level of vulnerability and empathy there in the leadership. And I think one of the best ways to attract really good talent, and I've had a lot of success with this over the course of my career, is if you authentically engage in a high performing culture, a growth minded culture, the people who are already on your team are going to bring those people with them. I rarely have hired people on one of my teams over the course of my career that were not a referral from somebody who was already on my team. And it's like any experience. When people have a good experience, they will tell their friends, they will tell their former colleagues, like, come join us, do this. Like that is the easiest way to get good people. The good people you already have will bring them with them. And, there's no higher compliment. There is no better way to vet and vouch for people than, having someone you already trust and somebody who already performs at a high level saying, hey, I used to work with this person that I think would be a great fit for the role. We should talk to them. And I've hired dozens of people that way. And it's always worked out to be a super successful way to bring people onto the team.
That makes a lot of sense. I think in terms of actual business, almost all of my clients come on a referral basis, and they are always like the best clients. And kind of from my standpoint, the easiest to work with.
Yeah,
So that makes sense that that would translate into building your teams as well.
absolutely.
Okay. This is kind of a wild card, but I'm super interested to hear what you think about this one. How much of hiring success do you attribute to process versus instinct?
This is a tough one. You know, I think process is the most important part of it. But we still have to trust our gut. Um, if I had to break it down, I'd probably say it's 70-30. 70% process, 30% instinct. Um, and you know, I would also say that, that instinct must be trained. It, not impulsive. And, there's a lot of research out there that shows that structured interviews are, far more predictive of job performance than unstructured ones. Consistent processes, things like including clear criteria, that could be work samples, um, gauging multiple perspectives. These things all reduce bias and increase hiring accuracy. Um, Instinct still matters, especially when it's built from experience, but gut feelings alone are often unreliable. And one of the biggest things that we run into leaders, or biggest problems we run into leaders when making any decision, especially around hiring, is our instinct is prone to confirmation bias. And it's also prone to things like liking. And we are naturally inclined to gravitate towards people who are like us, who have backgrounds similar to us, experiences similar to us. And if we were hiring just based on that criteria, we'd have a lot of teams that look exactly like us. And what happens then is you don't have people challenging your beliefs, you don't have diversity of backgrounds and ideas, you don't have diversity of perspectives and problem solving processes, and you're really doing yourself a massive disservice in hiring that way. So having a process and a structure and being able to gauge candidates in a objective way is really important. Um, you know, most roles you're going to get hundreds of applicants for, and being able to structure that in a way that is fair and transparent is super important. I would say where I lean on instinct the most is if I'm between a few people, and it's not so much getting a feeling that somebody is the right person, but once in a while, like, there will just be something where you get that feeling in your gut that somebody's not going to work out for whatever reason, or um, you're feeling that they're not the right person. Like, that's where I lean into instinct a little more. But doing that in the beginning, you're probably going to limit yourself on the quality of candidates, and you're probably going to make the wrong hiring decision.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that I for sure lean into gut instincts when we get kind of down to the wire. I almost have the exact opposite of you though. When I'm down to a couple candidates, a lot of times I'll have this like feeling like this is the right person. This is for sure who we need to go with. It's not so much that the other person is bad or that I like think that they're not going to work out. It's just I'll have this really strong inclination that this is the right person for the right, for that role. Um, and I do think that there's a lot to be said for that. I think that for me, obviously not nearly as experienced as you are in building teams. So I probably shouldn't be leaning into my gut instincts as much, but I'm trying to build out the experience. And I think that those inclinations for me do definitely come from the people though that showcase like the kind of growth mindset and the high potential low experience stuff. I definitely have, you know, a bias because obviously because of my background, I didn't necessarily go the traditional route, although I have gone to school now. That's not where I started. And so I have an appreciation for people also that haven't necessarily gone the traditional route and that don't always look the way we want exactly on paper. So I think that's where a lot of like my bias comes in, but then a lot of like my gut instincts too. I'll see these like inclinations in how they process things and work. And that's what gets me excited.
I would also say to that point is individuals need to figure out what works for them. And what works for me in building a team isn't necessarily the perfect formula for everyone else. And, there are different types of teams, there are different skill sets you're looking for, different job functions. And, that could change from role to role depending on what you're hiring for. And, that gut reaction may be different in an individual contributor role versus someone you're hiring to be a director or VP. And, some of these things are, listening to your gut, listening to your instincts, but also, looking at all the data you've collected and making a decision based on all of those factors. And, I think if you're following all of the information that you've gathered and you're making an intelligent decision that way, like you're typically going to make the right decision. But even then, like it's something that we all make mistakes in. We all have hired people that we shouldn't have. We've all passed on people that we probably should have hired. But it's something that we got to remind ourselves, like in that moment, we did the best that we could with the information that we had. And, you learn from it going forward.
Absolutely. I think too, I mean, just to your point, people are wild cards. So everything can totally look like it aligns. It can, everything's right that they're saying, everything's right on paper, everything is right as far as like their actions and their follow through. And then sometimes they get into that role and it's just not the right fit either on their end or your end. So there's a lot of variables.
And some people are great on paper and interview incredibly well and
Mm-hmm.
don't perform. And
Yeah.
there's other people that, you know, they may check out on paper and they don't interview well.
Mm-hmm.
And, sometimes you take a chance on them and they become the best decision you ever could have made. I think like that's another thing where sometimes you lean into gut a bit. And again, it depends on the role. You don't always need people who interview well. You don't need people that, in certain roles where they're going to be presenting to executive leadership all day. Some of the best creatives I've had, like they wanted to have their heads down, doing the creative work and be an individual contributor and had no desire to go into leadership. And like those people are incredibly valuable. And being able to find the right people for those roles is a different skill set than finding a director or a VP for your team. Much different.
For sure. I'm actually, so right now, one of the roles I'm recruiting for is a sales position. And
Mm.
then another one is for an accounting manager. And I cannot tell you how different, those sets of people look when you're talking about how they interview. Because the accountants, I love, okay, listen, my degree's in accounting. I love all my accountants out there. Not as charismatic as salespeople. Okay. They're not going to interview that same way. So again, thank you for just pointing out that there are all these nuances, just really depending on what the role is.
Well, there's also a lot of. I mean, this would be an entirely different podcast, but uh, that we could go into about how personality types affect career decisions and what people gravitate towards, and
Yes.
that's a really important thing to keep in mind as well.
Okay, can we do a little sidebar on that? Where do you fall? Because there's like a billion different, people have you take like disc assessments or I don't know, whatever all the different kinds are. Do you believe in any of those? Do you think that they're valuable? What's your personal opinion?
I I think they have value, and there's lots of different ones. One that I have found to be very effective, especially like on an executive coaching level, is Hogan. It gives you a really great overview of people's strengths, weaknesses, kind of the sweet spot they operate in. Um, there's things like DISC, there's things like Myers Briggs, um, there's Big Five, there's Clifton Strengths. Um, they can be really helpful supplemental tools if used correctly. Um, but again, like you want to use them as one data point out of many. Um, you want to be careful not to hire somebody based on just a personality assessment. And they can enhance the understanding of communication, team fit. Um, you want to make sure if it's part of a hiring process that the assessment that you're using is job relevant and validated. Um, but I think it's more important to use these tools as conversation starters. Um, I think they can deepen insight, but still need to be paired with structured interviews. You know, you may pair a personality assessment with a structured interview and a job simulation, and you've got reference checks. You've got all kinds of data points that you want to assess as a part of the hiring process. And the one thing that I am careful about with assessments is you need to recognize that the results of those assessments can change over time. And if somebody's having a stressful day or a bad day, the results of their Myers-Briggs might be different today than it would be tomorrow. And it's not going to be significantly different. But even things like DISC, the results tend to change over time. So you don't want to use it as a hard and fast science to make decisions. You want to use it as another data point, to figure out how this person operates, how they might fit into the team. Um, Sometimes it's figuring out, how can you bring diversity of personality and thought and approach into a team, as much as you want to bring in somebody that fits, because it can also be something that plays into a bias you have. So that can be challenging as well. So it's really about thinking about all the different data points and using these things as one of those factors out of many when considering making a hiring decision.
Definitely. No, I think it does have to be a holistic approach. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but even in some of the instances where we have used these assessments, we'll have people that use the assessments to basically tell you what you want to hear for that role. It's almost, you know what I mean? Like, kind of, they know how to rig the system to like fill out these answers in the way that they think aligns best with the role. And then you'll meet with these people and you'll speak with them and you'll be like, I don't think you filled that out correctly.
Where where I historically have found these types of assessments to be more helpful is when you're building a team and you're trying to improve team cohesion, communication, culture. Having the entire team complete one of these types of assessments, especially something like DISC, and what it does is it gives people a really great set of data and insights into how their coworkers operate and how they communicate differently, why they communicate differently. Um, I think that's a really great way to drive empathy in the team and create understanding, um, because people communicate in much different ways, and often, again, going back to like an accountant versus a salesperson, there are probably plenty of situations that people can think of where in a professional environment those two communication styles may drive each other insane because it's not what they're used to. It's not, you know, the way people communicate, they typically think is the best way to do it. When that's not reciprocal, they think that the other person is slacking or not doing things right. And when you create some transparency around personality types and personality assessments and communication assessments, people can learn a lot about where people are coming from, and it can really create a lot of team cohesion when there's an understanding about why people operate the way they do, and then there's often a realization that, okay, even though it's different doesn't mean it's wrong.
Right.
There are multiple ways to get to the right solution or to accomplish things effectively, and that's where I find it to be most beneficial. But it can also be helpful in hiring.
That makes a lot of sense. What's the phrase that you used? Not psychological vulnerability, but
Psychological
when,
safety.
yes, because I feel like, going through that process as a team when you're already in that safe environment would make a lot of sense, and you would get the most accurate results if you already have people that feel like they can answer those questions in an authentic way. Oh, this is a good one. Okay. Can you share a hiring mistake that taught you a valuable lesson?
Going back to hiring somebody that looked great on paper, I have made that mistake, and I once hired somebody who had an incredible background. On paper, they were amazing. Their resume was amazing. They had done incredible work for very high level clients, very high level publications. They interviewed very well. The second they got on the team, it became painfully clear they were a terrible culture fit,
Oh
especially
no.
in terms of collaboration, humility, where their technical skills were top tier, and the end result was, some of the most beautiful work I've ever seen. They struggled to build trust. They never aligned with the team's working style. Um, it was a disaster, and everyone around them was miserable, and everyone on the teams that supported their function were miserable. And I think what that taught me was some of the things we've been talking about is, really probing deeper during interviews, like, really getting to what motivates people, what their working style is, what their communication style is. And not just figuring out what someone can do, but figuring out how they do it and whether or not they will elevate the collective dynamic of the team. And it's very hard to interview for. It's very hard to measure for. Maybe that's something where that gut instinct comes in a little heavier. But I do think giving people hypothetical situations and having them respond to how they might interact or react in those situations can be a good way to gauge some of those dynamics.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great little golden nugget right there, and something that can be implemented really when you're hiring for any role. That's a good
Absolutely.
cover all. Excellent. All right. Well, I know you have to run. Chris is booked and busy. He's out here consulting. So I'm going to let you go for now. I think obviously we'll have you on again at some point. You're working on a book, right?
I am. I'm wrapping up a book now about empathetic leadership, which will be published by Forbes sometime this fall, shooting for mid October. So be on the lookout for that.
Perfect. We'll have you back when you're on the book tour.
Looking forward to it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Chris.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Yeah. All right. I'll see everybody next week.